Aram Hair. Why I'm a Demi-vegetarian. This is Aram Hair. He was born in 1919 and he died in 2002. There are various pictures of him, mostly as an older person. So, who is Aram Hair? Well, he held the post of White's Professor of Moral Philosophy at the University of Oxford from 1966 until 1983. And then he was a graduate research professor of philosophy at the University of Florida from 1983 to 1994. And we see this he'll mention in a part of the reading that we look at about traveling back and forth between Britain and Florida. His metaethical theories were influential during the second half of the 20th century, and he's best known for his development of prescriptivism as a metaethical theory. And this is the analysis of formal features of moral discourse, justifying preference utilitarianism. Peter Singer, who we looked at earlier, studied Hare's work as an honors student at the University of Melbourne and came to know Hare personally while he was a graduate student at Oxford working on his B.Phil. All right, we're going to begin by looking at Hare's argument, and then we're going to see how it is he ends up there. Premise 1. We can divide arguments in favor of eating meat into three categories: dietetic, economic, and ethical. Premise 2. Dietetic arguments favor demi-vegetarianism over vegetarianism. Premise 3. Economic arguments favor demi-vegetarianism over vegetarianism. Premise 4. Ethical arguments favor demi-vegetarianism over vegetarianism. So, there are good reasons to favor demi-vegetarianism over vegetarianism. Now, I encourage you to look at the strength of the conclusion of this argument. Given what we might imagine from each of the premises, the conclusion of the argument is far from certain. That being said, Hare is going to argue that there are good reasons to favor demi-vegetarianism over vegetarianism. All right, I'm going to start with a reading from the intro where Hare will present a story that sets up the rest of the reading. If you haven't had a chance to read this article, it's written in a very accessible format, and I think it's pretty fun. The why in my title promises an explanation as well as a justification, so I can usefully begin with a little dietetic autobiography. I'm speaking only from my experience and not as an expert dietitian. I had a normal British upbringing until I found myself in 1940 in the Indian Army. There, I acquired a strong taste for curries, including the delicious dal lentil curries that our Punjabi soldiers filled their chapdas with. When, in 1942, I found myself a prisoner of war after the fall of Singapore, we all knew that we were going to have thin time, and most of us expected that we would suffer in health by eating little or no meat. But this turned out not to be the case. Our dietetic experiences can be divided into three periods. In the first, in Singapore, we had plenty of polished or white rice, a few musty rice polishings, and very little meat, fish, and vegetables. There was not much ground to grow vegetables in, and a pig farm, which the Japanese made us set up, did not prosper. During this period, we suffered a number of deficiency diseases owing to the unbalanced diet, there being too much carbohydrates in proportion to the other ingredients. But none of our troubles were attributed to lack of protein. Then, when we were set up for 8 months to work as coolies on the Burma Railway, we got very little food altogether and suffered from a lot of all kinds of diseases owing to our debilitated state and the numerous infections that were going around. Between 20 and 40% of the group I was in died. I did not know the exact figure, but there is relevant information in Dunlop, 1987. When we got back to Singapore, we had for the first time larger vegetable gardens and grew sweet potatoes, of which we ate mainly the leaves, kailon, or Malabar spinach, kangkong, a kind of water canolivus, tapioca, and small quantities of other vegetables. At the same time, our rice ration diminished to very little. The result was that we stopped suffering from deficiency diseases because our diet, though insufficient in quantity, was now well balanced, and we got small quantities of legumes for protein. So inefficient was it that we were getting not much over 800 calories a day and became very thin. I came out of prison in 1945 weighing about 30 pounds less than my pre-war weight of 150 pounds and made it up in a month. I now, at age 73, weigh about 165 pounds, which is at the bottom of the ideal weight range for my height. Since we did not appear to have suffered from lack of meat, I had become disposed to being a vegetarian and had acquired a great love of growing vegetables, which had probably saved our lives. When my wife and I married in 1947, we talked about our diet, and I wanted to eat only vegetables, not for the reasons usually advanced nowadays, but because rationing was still in force in Britain, and it seemed sensible to leave the meat for those who thought they needed it. But my wife argued that when we had children, they ought to be given meat to make them grow strong. And so, having no really convincing arguments to set against this, I gave in, and we resumed a normal British diet, growing as many of our own vegetables as we could, in continuation of the Dig for Victory movement that had been popular during the war. At first, we had little land, and I had no time to travel to and from a rented vegetable patch. When we moved out into the country in 1966, we had a large and beautiful garden, but the vegetable garden attached to the property had been retained by the previous owners to expand his honey business. There are a few fruit trees, but it seemed a shame to dig up the flower beds and lawns, so in the end we got ourselves a vegetable patch 5 minutes walk away and became almost self-supporting in vegetables. This made us feel good and seemed to improve our health, and we'd ended up eating very little meat at all. Very recently, when the swimming pool that we had inherited with the property perished from old age, we filled it with soil, gave up on the other patch, and now grow most of our vegetables we need within this curtilage. So, we became demi-vegetarians largely by accident, and without having any of the moral reasons usually given. Though, as I said, it did make us feel good to be growing such a large portion of what we were eating. It was only relatively recently, under the influence of Peter Singer and other animal liberationists, that I've started to take seriously these usual moral reasons for not eating meat. I began then to contemplate becoming a full vegetarian, but was unable to convince myself that it was morally required. I did, for a time, give up eating fish, which, in any case, my wife intensely dislikes, on the grounds that fish are nearly always killed cruelly. But I started eating them again after I'd been persuaded, wrongly I now believe, by physiologist colleague that fish lack the part of the brain that mediates suffering. So we see Hare setting up the story and of why he considers himself to be a demi-vegetarian. It follows from his time in the war, and then his experience as he aged. All right, before we get into the rest of the reading, let's consider some helpful distinctions. So we have our fellow there in the middle, and we see on his left fish at the bottom, and then meat, and then on the right we see vegetables, and then eggs, honey, and milk. These different groups will help us figure out some distinctions that will be helpful moving forward. Now, a pescatarian is a person who doesn't eat meat, but eats fish as well as vegetables and other animal products, including eggs, milk, and honey. A vegetarian doesn't eat meat of any kind, but will eat other animal products, including eggs, honey, and milk. And a vegan doesn't eat any meat or any kind of animal products. So they'll eat vegetables, but they won't eat eggs or honey or milk. So this is sort of an overview of most of the common ways that these positions are presented. However, you'll notice that there is another one that maybe many of us have not heard of, the demi-vegetarian. A demi-vegetarian is someone who, while not being a full vegetarian, let alone a vegan, eats little meat and is careful what kinds of meat they eat. So now we'll look at Hare's description of a demi-vegetarian. My wife and my own practice is to buy little or no meat or fish for ourselves to eat at home to support ourselves so far as we can on our own vegetables, which is hard if one lives half the year in Florida and half in England, though we are gradually learning how to do it. When we have guests who we think will not like to eat no meat, we buy some, and we allow ourselves to eat meat in restaurants when there is no obvious alternative. When we eat in other people's homes, we tend to say that we are demi-vegetarian. It makes a good conversation and propaganda, explaining what this means, and ostensibly ask for a half helping of meat and lots of vegetables. The result is that, all told, we eat extremely little meat by ordinary standards, since we do not eat out much except when traveling. All right. So, moving forward, now that we understand what Hare means when he says demi-vegetarian, we're going to consider what his strategy is. So, Hare divides arguments in favor of eating meat into 3 categories, and then tries to show that the arguments for each category support demi-vegetarianism over vegetarianism. These 3 categories of arguments include dietetic arguments, this is arguments about diet, economic arguments, and ethical arguments. Can you think of any other categories of arguments that Hare might be missing? I'm quite convinced by my own experiences that one can live more healthily without meat, but not that one can live without protein. That's not to say that meat is not a valuable source of protein, so that if there are other reasons for producing some, they would be supported by my dietetic considerations. Against this, it's now said that a diet containing a lot of animal products, especially fat, is bad for the cardiovascular system. And I believe it. This, however, is a reason only for eating selected meat in small quantities, not for leaving it out of one's diet altogether. It's also a reason for avoiding other animal fats, such as milk products and also eggs. But I find it hard to believe that moderate consumption of these foods does one any harm. And the dietitians are now saying that we ought to eat fish. I've learned recently that I have mild diabetes, like many people my age, and I have to control it by diet. But I do not think it has altered the argument very much. The conclusion that I reach from these dietetic considerations is that it's right from the health point of view to eat very little meat, but not none at all. So, we'll notice how Hare's arguments work here for his dietetic arguments, and we may or may not accept his account, but effectively what he's saying is that, look, the health considerations, the considerations of my diet, certainly speak in favor of eating very little meat, but they don't support not eating any meat at all. And again, we may agree with Hare, or we may disagree with him. It's interesting to think about why that might be. Okay, moving on to the economic arguments. This is an overview of these arguments. There's very good reason for saying that it's more economical to grow food in the form of vegetables than to grow fodder, feed it to animals, and then eat the animals. There are, however, 2 caveats or exceptions. So we see here what Hare is doing is saying, hey, it seems like it has to be more economical to grow food in the form of vegetables as opposed to growing food for animals and then feeding it to the animals and then eating the animals. However, as we'll see, he's identified 2 caveats or exceptions. One of these is that we want to be careful when growing all of the extra food that not raising animals would allow, not to grow so much extra food that it forces other countries to be non-self-supporting. We might call this something like the globalism objection, and I'm not so sure if it holds, but the idea certainly is that if we were to move towards, instead of growing food for animals and feeding it to the animals, instead just growing food for ourselves, one thing that we would want to be careful of is not growing so much food that other countries became dependent on the food that we grew. The other caveat that Hare identifies is that there are some places where it makes more sense to graze animals rather than growing vegetables, and some stock may be necessary to maintain the soil's fertility. So this is actually two different responses. One of them is that there are some places where, because of the limited amount of dirt that's suitable for growing things, that in these situations it may be better to raise animals that are grazing there and then eat the animals. And then the other consideration here is that in some places it may be necessary to have stock to maintain the soil's health. So, given these considerations, according to Hare, it's better for there to be some animals raised for meat rather than none. And this, according to him, supports demi-vegetarianism. All right, so before we move on to the ethical arguments, we can cover what Hare's done so far. So far, he has argued that demi-vegetarianism is supported over vegetarianism in the case of his dietetic arguments, and that demi-vegetarianism is supported over vegetarianism in the case of his economic arguments. Now, what's left are the ethical arguments. The ethical arguments that Hare considers fall into two subclasses. The first subclass of arguments concern the alleged wrongness of killing animals, regardless of whether this involves suffering or not, and he calls this the killing arguments. And then the second subclass of arguments is concerned with the wrongness of causing suffering to animals, whether or not they are killed. This we'll call the suffering argument. All right, as for the alleged wrongness of killing, for utilitarians, doing wrong to animals must involve harming them, and this has to be considered as harm overall. If a course of action involves some harm, but greater benefits, and there's no alternative with a greater balance of good over harm, it won't be wrong. So we have to ask if the process of raising animals to kill them causes them more harm or benefit. And here's Hare's answer to this question. My answer is that assuming, as we must assume, if we are to keep the killing argument distinct from the suffering argument, that they're happy while they live, it does not. For it's better for an animal to have a happy life, even if it's a short one, rather than no life at all. All right, let's expand on Hare's answer a little bit. So, given Hare's response in this case, he does, however, have some ethical commitments. From the point of view of such a theory, it would seem that the issue about killing animals, as distinct from causing them suffering, resolves itself into not the question of whether it is all right to kill animals, but the question of how many live animals of different species, including the human, we ought to cause there to be. So, according to Hare, the question of if it's wrong to kill animals ultimately becomes a question about how many live animals of different species we ought to cause there to be in the world. This is because the only way that it makes sense for a utilitarian to talk about killing animals is in terms of overall suffering. And the only way that we can answer the question about overall suffering is to answer the question about how many live animals there should be. So Hare has a unique solution to figuring out how many live animals there should be. This involves introducing a concept called quality-adjusted life years, or QALY. So, to help us try to figure out this answer, Hare introduces this concept, quality-adjusted life years. The quality-adjusted life years that an animal enjoys are the number of years lived by that animal multiplied by a factor corresponding to the average quality of life enjoyed during those years. This is a measure often used by doctors when considering a life-altering procedure. how long is a being going to live, and what is its average quality of life over these years? So, to answer our question about how many and what kind of animals there should be, we should try to maximize the amount of QALYs of sentient beings. So, the idea here is that if animals live a short life, but that short life is very happy, this gives them a high QALY number, or quality adjusted life year. I do not believe that we should be doing this, minimizing animals' QALYs, if we refrained from eating animals. The reason is that if we gave up eating animals, the market for meat would vanish, and no more animals would be raised for meat production. Such animals as there were would be either wild or kept as pets, or kept for other economic purposes such as milk, eggs, and wool production. And it's certain that there would be very many fewer domestic animals than at the present time live. This thought gives me pause when I walk in the fields around my home in England and see a great many apparently happy animals, all destined to be eventually eaten. All right, and then Hare expands on this a little bit more in a place that I will read now. Let us, to make the position clearer, consider some more extreme, though not fictitious, cases. In our village, there's also a trout farm. The fish start their lives in moderately commodious ponds and have what I guess is a pleasant life for fish, with plenty to eat. In due course, they're lifted out in buckets and put immediately into tanks in the farm building. Purchasers select their fish, which is then killed by being banged smartly on the head and handed to the customer. I'm fairly certain that if given the choice, I would prefer the life all told of such a fish to that of almost any fish in the wild, and to non-existence. So I'm going to pause here before I move on and ask what we think of that claim, right? It's a very interesting claim that, according to Hare, he would prefer the life of the fish raised in a farm to that of a wild fish. Now, Hare continuing. Again, suppose that one were able to keep animals in ideal conditions under one's own supervision, as the youngs, whom I mentioned earlier, do, and then kill them to eat them without causing them suffering, at least more suffering than they would have from a natural death. Would I consider that one had done these animals a service by bringing them into existence to have that sort of life and death? The youngs, I am sure, would answer yes, and they claim to have reconverted some converts to vegetarianism. They do not slaughter their animals themselves, but have made what they think are satisfactory arrangements with the local public abator, and always accompany the animals there to see that they suffer the minimum of fear. They claim that even their pigs never squeal, which is remarkable because pigs, being highly intelligent animals, nearly always know when something nasty is in the offering. The young's pigs, I must add, are some of the most well-liking pigs I've ever seen, and the same can be said of their sheep. If all farm animals were as well looked after as theirs, there would be no complaints about cruelty involved in animal husbandry. All right, so we can see from this what Hare has in mind with the quality-adjusted life years of the animals that you eat as a demi-vegetarian. Now, we'll transition to considering the moral impact of the harm done to animals. It must be remembered that if what I've said about the morality of killing animals is correct, our aim should be to bring it about, not that no animals are killed, but that the quantity multiplied by the quality of animals, including human life, is maximized. We therefore do not want everyone to be full vegetarians. Rather, we want there to be enough meat eating in the world to sustain the number of animals that there ought to be, whatever that is. And here, Hare makes a distinction between predation and husbandry, and comes to the following conclusions. Predation is morally less suspect than most kinds of husbandry. So, predation is hunting for animals, whereas husbandry, of course the act of raising animals, presents more difficult moral problems, some of which Hare's mentioned already. At the best, the fish farm and the Young's farm on Cotswolds that he described earlier seem to be okay, and most forms of factory farming are all wrong. But all kinds of farms in between need careful distinctions in which details he has no room to consider here. So we can see Hare has flagged that husbandry presents a wide range of problems, but he's going to, for the most part, set that aside. I will try now to sum up my very tentative conclusions. First, there are good dietetic and economic arguments for demi-vegetarianism, but they do not support full vegetarianism. Secondly, the moral argument, based on the wrongness of killing animals, collapses completely in the face of the objection that by accepting it, we should, in practice, reduce the number of animals, and thus the total amount of animal welfare. Thirdly, the suffering of animals in most commonly practiced forms of animal husbandry are scandalous. But the best way of improving matters is not easy to find. I'm inclined to the view that though homage must be paid to the courage of the full vegetarians who stand out completely against meat eating, and though they undoubtedly do a lot to propagate better practices, more could perhaps be done if a much greater number of people could be converted to demi-vegetarianism, and if they had more easily available the information they needed in order to select those animal products that are produced by methods which minimize suffering to animals. I think that there are some, that controlled predation is one of them, but the factual questions involved here are so complex that I hesitate to discuss them, not being an expert in these matters. Lastly, 3 questions of how the numbers of various species should be apportioned within the available resources and ecological limits is an immensely difficult moral question, whose solution requires both an understanding of some rather deep philosophical issues, which I've dealt with elsewhere, including the papers I've referred to, and a grasp of the enormously complicated ecological issues which affect the answer. Nobody that I know has mastered both of these groups of issues. Few philosophers have even begun to master the ecology, and few ecologists and other environmentalists have even begun to understand the logic of the arguments and the pitfalls which beset them. So, there's everything to be said for the 2 disciplines getting together. Lastly, 3 questions. All right. So, this leaves us with Hare's argument again to close us out. We can divide arguments in favor of eating meat into 3 categories: dietetic, economic, and ethical. Dietetic arguments favor demi-vegetarianism over vegetarianism. Economic arguments favor demi-vegetarianism over vegetarianism. And ethical arguments favor demi-vegetarianism over vegetarianism. So, there are good reasons to favor demi-vegetarianism over vegetarianism.